The scream didn't beg for help, it surrendered to it. From his balcony high above Chicago's sleepless streets, Sebastian Crowl heard it slice through glass and steel, a sound so quietly broken it forced an immortal predator to move. That night, one act of violence would awaken a love centuries dead. Welcome, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. We're really glad to have you here. Before we get started, take a quick moment to say hello in the comments and let us know where you're watching from. I'd love to see where everyone is tuning in from, what city, state, or country you're joining us from today. Feel free to introduce yourself as well. And if you're watching live or on replay, let us know that too. Go ahead and drop in the chat. And once again, welcome. We're excited to have you here. Sebastian Crowl had lived long enough to know the difference between noise and pain. The city produced plenty of the former: sirens, laughter, engines grinding against wet asphalt. But pain carried a different frequency. It traveled low, almost embarrassed, as if afraid to be heard. When it reached him, he was standing barefoot on the balcony of his townhouse, dressed in black silk and crimson lining, white hair bound neatly at the nape of his neck. The crystal tumbler in his hand remained untouched. He had lost interest in blood hours ago. Chicago pulsed beneath him, alive and indifferent. Then came the scream. It drifted from across the narrow street, from an older residential building stubbornly wedged between newer steel towers. Third floor. One light flickered on and off, like a failing heart. Sebastian's gaze sharpened, senses unfolding. He heard a man's voice next, controlled, educated, practiced in dominance. "You make me do this." Sebastian was already gone. He crossed the distance without spectacle, a blur of red and black slipping through shadow and stairwell. Inside the apartment, the air reeked of fear and copper. Carter Wrek stood near the center of the living room, sleeves rolled up, an expensive watch glinting on his wrist. He looked composed, inconvenienced rather than enraged, as if violence were a chore forced upon him. On the floor lay Isolde Hawl. She was curled slightly on her side, one arm wrapped protectively around her stomach. Her sweater hung loose on her small frame, stained dark near the hem. Her face was bruised, lips split, but her eyes, steady, exhausted, unbroken, lifted to Sebastian without surprise. Not relief, recognition, as if some part of her had always known someone would come, even if too late. Something twisted inside Sebastian's chest. That sensation was unfamiliar, dangerous. Carter turned, irritation flashing across his face. What the hell? The room dropped 10 degrees. Sebastian did not bare his fangs. He did not raise his voice. He simply stood there, presence pressing down like gravity, red and black swallowing the light. "You will never touch her again," he said softly. Carter laughed, a brittle sound. "You think you can just walk in here and—" Sebastian looked at him. The laugh died. What followed was quick and precise. No blood spilled, no bones broken beyond repair. Carter Wrek would live. He would wake tomorrow to find his accounts frozen, his partners vanished, his carefully built influence reduced to ash. His voice would fail him in every room that once bent to his will. The city would forget him without ever knowing why. Sebastian left him breathing on the floor. That was not mercy. It was education. When he knelt beside Isolde, she was shaking, though she tried to hide it. Her hands trembled as if her body were catching up to what her mind refused to feel. "You're safe," Sebastian said. She nodded slowly. "I just need a moment." He noticed the blood then. Too much. Her breathing was careful, measured, as if she were holding herself together by will alone. When she looked up, she reached for him with hesitant fingers and placed his hand over her stomach. "He didn't hurt the baby," she whispered. Sebastian froze. He believed her instantly. Vampires trusted scent, pulse, instinct, but belief was rarer. And belief, he would later learn, was where immortals made their worst mistakes. He gathered her carefully, as though she were made of something fragile and sacred, and carried her into the night. Below them, the city continued its hum, unaware that something ancient had shifted. Sebastian told himself this was intervention, nothing more. He did not yet know that this moment would dismantle centuries of restraint, or that some losses bled deeper than death itself. Sebastian's townhouse smelled faintly of cedar and wine, a scent he cultivated to calm himself, though tonight it did little. He guided Isolde to the leather chaise in the corner, soft enough to cradle her without seeming indulgent, yet firm enough to prevent collapse. She sank into it as though every ounce of her weight carried all the fear and fatigue of the world. He crouched beside her, careful not to touch too much, careful not to startle. "You should not be here alone," he said, his voice low, more a statement than a question. Her hands clenched in her lap. "I've been alone too long," she admitted quietly. It's nothing new." Sebastian studied her face. Her eyes, dark and luminous even in dim light, flickered between defiance and exhaustion. The corners of her lips trembled, threatening a smile that never arrived. She looked like someone trying to survive a storm while standing in open air. Her secret, her loss, was locked behind that fragile calm. He sensed it before she spoke it. "You're hiding something," he said softly, noting the subtle tension in her shoulders. "A truth that doesn't fit your words." Isolde's gaze flicked to the floor, avoiding his. It's complicated." Her voice was thin, hesitant. "It's easier if you believe what you want." Sebastian did not respond immediately. He had lived long enough to recognize the masks humans wore. Fear, grief, defiance. They were layers that sometimes lasted a lifetime. But this was different. This felt permanent. Her grief was not a shield. It was a wound. He stood and moved to the window, looking down at the city, then back to her. "Carter Wrek won't touch you again. Not him. Not anyone he's aligned with." A flash of anger crossed her face. Not at him, but the reality behind his words. She exhaled sharply, leaning back into the chaise. "You don't understand. You think this ends with him, but it doesn't. There are consequences I can't escape." Sebastian's brows furrowed. "Explain." She hesitated, jaw tightening. I lost it." The words escaped in a whisper. Her hands gripped the chaise so tightly her knuckles whitened. "The baby, the doctor, it's gone." The room fell silent. Sebastian, for the first time in decades, felt a physical hollow in his chest, a pull he could not name. His instincts had sensed trauma, but not its depth. He knelt again beside her, placing a steadying hand on her shoulder, careful not to overstep. "I am sorry," he said simply, but he could feel the inadequacy of the words like a knife. She shook her head, eyes misting. "Don't be. This is mine to bear." Sebastian's mind cataloged possibilities. Humans grieved in such messy, fragile ways. They blamed themselves, carried invisible weight, and rarely let anyone in. Isolde had survived brutality from Carter Wrek. Yet this silent, invisible wound was far crueler. He wanted to shield her from it, to erase the pain as easily as he erased threats to her life. But grief was human, stubborn, and brutal in its permanence. "Do you want revenge?" he asked quietly, not as a threat, but as a bridge. Her eyes flared, but only for a moment. "No," she said, voice trembling. "I don't even want justice. I just want to survive it." Sebastian nodded slowly, understanding more than he wished he did. Survival would take patience, protection, and silence. That he could offer, that he had always offered selectively, but now, selectively became personal. The night stretched around them, thick with tension and unspoken truths. Outside, Chicago remained indifferent. Cars hummed, neon signs buzzed, the wind brushed against steel towers. But inside, time was a fragile construct. Sebastian moved through it differently. Centuries had taught him that patience was power, observation was understanding, and restraint could be savior. Tonight, all three were necessary. He rose, moving to a cabinet in the corner, and pulled out a dark bottle of wine. He poured 2 glasses, one untouched. One slid across the table to her. "Drink," he instructed gently. "You need it." She stared at the glass for a long moment, then hesitated. "I shouldn't." "You should," he interrupted softly. "Tonight, survival takes precedence. Everything else can wait." She lifted the glass, trembling slightly, and took a small sip. The faint aroma of cherry and oak filled the space, grounding her to the present. She exhaled, a little of the tension leaving her. Sebastian watched silently, noting each micro-expression, each involuntary shiver. "You're very quiet," she finally said, voice low. "Do you always watch people like this?" Sebastian considered. "I intervene," he said. "I watch first. The world is loud, chaotic, and careless. Observing allows me to decide who is worth protecting and who is worth letting learn their lessons." Her eyes studied him carefully. "And me? Am I worth protecting?" The question hung in the air, more fragile than her physical state. Sebastian felt a flicker of something unfamiliar. Hesitation. "Yes," he said after a moment, truthfully. "You are." She looked away, her gaze tracing the city skyline, lost in shadows and light. "I don't know how to live after this," she admitted quietly. "Even without him, even with you, I feel like I'm walking in ruins." Sebastian knelt beside her again, placing his hand over hers, not touching the wound, but grounding her presence. "Then walk through them," he said, "one step at a time. And if you fall, I will catch you. You are not alone anymore." For a moment, her eyes glimmered, moisture reflecting the faint light of his red and black interior, the very essence of him. The vampire's promise was not just protection. It was commitment, silent, eternal, and unrelenting. A faint sound outside made Sebastian glance toward the window. He saw nothing but the city humming indifferently. But he knew. Carter Wrek's shadow lingered, an unfinished threat. Yet tonight, that shadow did not matter. Tonight, survival, grief, and the strange, tentative connection between predator and human defined the room. And for the first time in a long while, Sebastian wondered if he had underestimated the power of living with someone worth saving. Sebastian did not sleep that night. The city outside slumbered in indifferent chaos, but inside his mind turned over the events of the evening like a blade in gloved hands. Carter Wrek was alive, yes, but hollowed, stripped of influence, humiliated in ways that would haunt him longer than any physical injury. Sebastian had ensured that. The man's empire would collapse quietly, discreetly, the world none the wiser, but the personal consequences would fester. Isolde, meanwhile, had drifted into a shallow, restless sleep on the chaise. Her body betrayed the quiet strength of her mind, shaking with residual tension. Sebastian watched her carefully, noting the lines of worry etched into her face, the slight tremor of her hands, even as she clutched the throw over her stomach. The loss she bore, unspoken, private, hung heavier than any bruise, any threat. She had survived the violence, yes, but the emptiness was worse. By early morning, Sebastian had decided on a course of action. He could not undo what Carter had done, or the consequences that followed, but he could ensure that neither Carter nor anyone like him would touch her again. He moved through his townhouse with quiet precision, selecting documents, arranging his affairs, preparing the tools of influence. For someone like Carter Wrek, destruction need not be visible. It was more effective when subtle, when woven into the very systems that supported his life. Sebastian's phone buzzed. He didn't answer immediately. When he did, it was a controlled, deliberate gesture. "Yes." A voice on the other end was nervous, hurried. A key associate of Carter's, unaware that the spider's web had already been dismantled. "Sir, it's Carter. He's asking," he's panicked. "He doesn't understand how." "Then let him continue not understanding," Sebastian said coldly. "He will learn in time. Do not speak to him again unless instructed." The line went silent. Sebastian ended the call and replaced the device carefully. His mind returned to Isolde. She was awake now, sitting with the throw around her shoulders, staring out the window at the city that seemed to have no memory of what had occurred. "Coffee?" he asked, stepping into the kitchen. She shook her head. "No, I can't." He nodded, accepting the refusal, and poured himself a cup. The aroma filled the space between them, offering a small, human comfort he didn't particularly enjoy but understood as necessary. "Carter Wrek will not bother you again," he said again. The words were both reassurance and warning. Do you understand? She turned to face him, eyes wary, tired, conflicted. Yes, but that doesn't erase what happened or what's gone. Her voice was barely audible. Sebastian set the coffee aside and walked to the window. His reflection, white hair bound neatly, red lining catching faint light, black suit pressed, was perfect, controlled. Yet inside, a rare uncertainty stirred. He had faced death countless times, witnessed empires crumble, but human grief, real, raw, intimate, was unfamiliar territory. And Isolde Hawl, quiet, unyielding, and beautiful in her understated strength, had inserted herself into that unfamiliar space. A faint noise outside drew his attention. A car door slammed several streets below, an ordinary sound, yet he instinctively tensed. Carter's network was fractured, yes, but desperate men made unpredictable moves. He would act if necessary, but for now, he watched and waited. Isolde remained silent, her gaze distant. Finally, she spoke. Do you ever regret it? Sebastian turned, curious. Regret what? Intervening, coming into my life, saving me. Her words were hesitant, almost fragile. You've seen centuries, countless people. You walk away when you need to. Why not now? He paused. Her question lingered. It was not something he had considered. Intervention was calculated, precise, never emotional. Yet with Isolde, the rules shifted subtly, imperceptibly. Because some things deserve more than calculation, he replied finally, deliberately vague. Some things demand presence. Her brow furrowed. And me? Sebastian hesitated, the briefest flicker of emotion crossing his features before it was masked. You, he said softly, deserve safety and a chance to recover. That is all. He did not lie, but he did not reveal the depth of what he felt, either. The hours passed. Sebastian organized the remnants of Carter Wrek's influence, dismantling accounts, redirecting assets, sending anonymous tips to partners who were willing to believe in rumors of embezzlement, mismanagement, failure. By the evening, Carter's world had quietly collapsed, a spiderweb removed with precision. Isolde observed him throughout, silent, contemplative. Her presence was grounding, unervingly so. She did not ask about his methods, nor did she question the outcomes. Yet Sebastian could feel her analyzing, judging, processing, something he had long expected immortals would grow tired of in humans. But she did not tire him. She intrigued him. Finally, as darkness swallowed the city, she spoke again. Do you ever feel lonely? Sebastian's lips twitched almost imperceptibly. Lonely is irrelevant. Immortality is not measured in companionship. She smiled faintly, almost wryly. Some of us measure it differently. Her words lingered as he left her to rest, pacing the townhouse in near silence. Outside, the city hummed, indifferent, yet beneath that hum, the faint echoes of Carter Wrek's downfall would ripple quietly through the lives he had touched. Sebastian, ever patient, would watch it unfold. And somewhere deep inside, he acknowledged a truth he could not yet name. Protecting Isolde was no longer just an assignment. Something personal had begun, something dangerous. Because for the first time in centuries, Sebastian Crowl was not just a shadow in red and black. He was entwined, and entwined was always vulnerable. The city had grown quiet again, but Sebastian did not sleep. He paced the polished floors of his townhouse, red and black suits catching the faint light, white hair slicked back into its precise ponytail. Outside, Chicago's pulse hummed below, unaware of the subtle war being waged in the shadows. Carter Wrek was scrambling, though he did not yet realize the depth of his fall. Each misstep he made would only tighten the trap Sebastian had silently prepared. Isolde remained in the chaise by the window, wrapped in a soft blanket that did nothing to warm the chill in her bones. Her eyes were vacant, reflecting the city lights like broken mirrors. She didn't speak much these days, and when she did, her voice carried the weight of unspoken grief. Sebastian had long ago learned to read what humans left unsaid, and hers screamed louder than words ever could. She flinched slightly as he approached, sensing his presence even without turning. "You're still awake," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "I'm always awake," he said softly, kneeling beside her. "But tonight I am watching, not pacing." She studied him, head tilted, eyes sharp despite the exhaustion. "Watching what?" "Carter Wrek," he replied, "and anyone else who thinks they can harm you." Her gaze darkened. "Do you ever feel it's too much?" Sebastian's lips curved slightly, almost imperceptibly. "Too much is subjective. I am patient. I can wait." She exhaled, a small puff of air that seemed to carry all the tension from her body. "And what about me? I'm not patient. I can't wait." Her hands trembled slightly as they clutched the blanket tighter. "I'm just surviving, day by day. But surviving doesn't make it easier." Sebastian studied her carefully. Her words were measured, yet fragile. She bore grief like armor, shielding herself from the world, from him. And yet, he saw the cracks. The flicker of emotion she tried to hide. That vulnerability was dangerous, but he could not look away. "You will survive," he said quietly, "and you will not be alone." She shook her head slowly. "Alone is all I've ever known. Maybe it's safer to stay that way." Sebastian's hand hovered near hers, but he did not touch. He knew humans often reacted poorly to comfort too quickly, and Isolde was no exception. He simply let her words hang in the air, absorbing them like he did everything else. The sound of a door opening several blocks away caught his attention. Not unusual in the city, yet instinctively, his senses picked up the subtle tremor of Carter Wrek's network. A desperate move. He had expected it. Carter was reckless now, unbalanced, and desperate men were dangerous. Sebastian would let him act. The consequences would teach him lessons words never could. "Carter is fragile," he said finally, his voice low. "He will try to strike, but he does not yet understand how powerless he has become." Isolde looked at him, expression unreadable. "And if he comes here?" Sebastian's eyes darkened slightly. "Then he will learn the full measure of my patience and my resolve." Her gaze fell to her lap. "I don't want revenge," she whispered. "I can't. I just want to heal." Sebastian nodded slowly, understanding her truth without question. "Healing is a process, but protecting you, that is my responsibility, not optional." She closed her eyes briefly, as if willing herself to find comfort in his words. But Sebastian noticed the subtle tremor in her shoulders, the way her fingers clenched the blanket. She was grieving, still privately, and he could not fix that. Not yet. Hours passed. Sebastian remained vigilant, moving quietly through the townhouse, observing, listening. The city outside seemed indifferent, but he knew better. Carter's desperation would manifest somewhere, sometime, and he would strike if he could. The vampire waited, patient and deliberate. Isolde remained at the window, lost in thought. Occasionally, she would glance at him, as though testing whether his presence was real. Sebastian did not offer words unless necessary, understanding that some wounds were too deep for conversation, too raw for immediate healing. Finally, the faintest sound of a notification reached them. Carter Wrek's email, desperate and incoherent. Sebastian read it carefully, noting every misspelling, every frantic sentence. The man's empire was unraveling, silently and invisibly. By morning, he would have nothing. And yet, the damage he had inflicted on Isolde could not be undone by papers or systems. Sebastian folded the message neatly and set it aside. "Carter Wrek is irrelevant," he said quietly. "Focus on yourself." She looked up at him, eyes glimmering with unshed tears. "I don't know if I can focus on myself." "You will," he said firmly, "because I will not allow you to be harmed again, and because you deserve better than mere survival." Her lips quivered, but she did not speak. Sebastian understood. She had built walls around herself, walls strong enough to keep out comfort, care, and trust. Yet cracks were forming. He would not rush her, but he would wait, quietly, for her to let him in. The night stretched on, thick with tension, grief, and unspoken truths. Outside, the city moved unaware of the fragile bond forming in the shadows. Two lives intertwined by circumstance, protection, and a pain too deep to name. Sebastian knew that tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for tonight, survival and presence were enough. And somewhere deep inside, he recognized a dangerous truth. He had begun to care, not just out of obligation, not just for duty, but for the fragile, human woman who had survived everything and yet remained standing. And caring, he knew, was always a vulnerability. The following morning, Chicago awakened under a gray sky, clouds hanging heavy over the skyline, like a warning to those who dared to move too recklessly. Sebastian stood by the window, his reflection in the glass a ghost of white hair and red and black precision. He did not sleep, did not rest, he watched. Carter Wrek had begun to act. Subtle attacks, anonymous tips, false rumors, all carefully orchestrated by desperate hands. He knew the man's type, a predator when comfortable, a coward when cornered. Carter Wrek had spent decades believing he controlled the world around him. Now he discovered that control was an illusion. Sebastian allowed himself the smallest satisfaction. Carter's panic was silent but potent. It would consume him slowly, deliberately, leaving him intact yet powerless, a living lesson in humility. Isolde, meanwhile, remained quiet. She moved through the townhouse as if walking through mist, her hands brushing surfaces, her eyes distant. The baby's loss remained unspoken, a hidden wound she had learned to carry alone. Sebastian had yet to confront it, though he sensed it like an ache beneath his chest. She did not need him to fix it. She needed him to endure it with her, to hold space for her grief without forcing her to speak. By mid-afternoon, the first sign of Carter's desperation reached them. A car parked too close to the townhouse, its engine idling in a way that suggested observation. Sebastian's senses picked up the faintest tremor of human fear and arrogance. He moved silently, red and black blending with the shadows as he exited the building, eyes scanning for the source. Carter's messenger had underestimated Sebastian's patience. The man was trembling behind the wheel, fumbling with a phone, trying to coordinate some insignificant retaliation. Sebastian did not approach him. He let the observation suffice. The fear he radiated was more effective than any confrontation. Returning to the townhouse, Sebastian found Isolde staring out the window, lips pressed into a line. "He's still here," she whispered, though her voice carried no panic, only acknowledgement. Sebastian's gaze followed hers. "He is powerless," he said calmly, "powerless to harm you, and he will remain so." She turned, eyes dark with unshed emotion. "And yet, he's still here. Watching, waiting. That's what makes it worse." Sebastian knelt beside her, placing a hand near hers without touching the wound she carried so silently. Some threats are only frightening because they are visible. The invisible ones, those that cannot touch you, are the ones that fade fastest. Her shoulders slumped slightly. "I don't want revenge. I just want peace." But peace seems impossible. Sebastian's lips tightened imperceptibly. "Peace is never impossible," he said softly. "It's a matter of removing the threat quietly, carefully, patiently." Hours passed, each tick of the clock punctuated by subtle movements in the city below. Carter Wrek's network faltered. His employees began questioning directives. Partners withdrew support. Anonymous messages spread doubt about his credibility. By evening, Sebastian had orchestrated nearly every piece of Carter's silent downfall. Yet, none of it mattered to Isolde. Her grief, her secret loss, consumed her more fiercely than any external threat. She moved to the chaise, hands trembling slightly as she curled into herself. Sebastian watched quietly, sensing the weight she carried, knowing that he could not lift it, but he could share it silently if she allowed it. "Sebastian," she whispered finally, voice tight, "do you ever think about what people deserve? Or what they've lost?" He looked at her, noting the faint shadows under her eyes, the curve of her lips as they tried to hold back pain. "All the time," he admitted. "But loss, it teaches lessons no one else can give." Her gaze fell to her hands. "And some lessons are unbearable." Sebastian remained silent, understanding without comment. The baby she had lost, the life that had never fully begun. He knew it was a wound that could not be healed with words or actions. Only presence, patience, and quiet vigilance could help her endure it. As night fell, Sebastian's senses caught movement outside the townhouse once more. Carter Wrek had grown reckless, leaving traces of his presence, a subtle but dangerous arrogance. Sebastian did not rush to confront him. He let him think he still had options, that he might strike back. Inside, Isolde sat quietly, staring at the city below. "I don't know how to live after this," she whispered, barely audible. "Even with you, even with all of this." Sebastian knelt beside her again, placing a hand near hers without touching the wound she carried. "You live because you must," he said softly, "and because I will not allow you to be harmed again. You will endure. You will survive." Her lips quivered, but she did not speak. He understood. Her grief was private, intense, unspoken, and he would bear it with her, silently, until she could speak again. Carter Wrek's email chimed once more, frantic and incoherent. Sebastian read it, noting every desperate word, every miscalculated move. The man's empire would collapse quietly, leaving him with nothing but fear and failure. Sebastian did not feel satisfaction. He felt resolve, because protecting Isolde was no longer just duty. It was personal, and somewhere deep inside, he acknowledged a dangerous truth. He had begun to care, not for the task, not for the plan, but for the human woman whose strength and fragility had begun to entangle with his own immortal existence. And caring, he knew, always brought risk. The night air pressed against the glass of Sebastian's townhouse like a prelude, cool and sharp, carrying the distant hum of the city below. Sebastian watched from the window, his reflection merging with the darkness outside. Carter Wrek's desperation had escalated beyond subtlety. Anonymous threats, taunting messages, shadowy figures lurking near Isolde's usual routes. It was as though he could feel the invisible hand tightening around him, yet could not see it. Sebastian moved silently through the townhouse, black-soled shoes muted on the polished wood floors. Red and black caught the faint light. White hair slicked back into its precise ponytail. He had remained a ghost in the shadows for centuries, yet this time, his prey was not merely a threat. This time, it was someone he could not afford to lose. Isolde sat in the living room, knees drawn up to her chest, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. She did not notice the subtle shift in the air, the faint rustle of movement, the way the shadows seemed to obey Sebastian's presence. She had grown accustomed to the quiet of his vigilance. Yet tonight, there was tension, electric and unspoken. "You've noticed it," he said quietly, kneeling beside her. She blinked, startled. "Noticed what?" "The way Carter Wrek has begun to overreach. Desperate men make mistakes. Reckless mistakes." She shivered, not from cold, but from the instinctive fear that clung to her even in safety. I thought it was over," she whispered. "I thought you'd already handled him." Sebastian's eyes darkened. "I have handled him, but power is not surrendered easily. He will try again, and each attempt will reveal more of his weakness. That is when he will learn his lesson." Her hands clenched the blanket. "I don't want him to touch me. I can't face that again." "You will not face it," Sebastian said firmly, voice steady, unyielding. "I will not allow it. Not him, not anyone." A sudden noise at the street below caught his attention. The faint sound of a door slamming, footsteps retreating. Sebastian's senses flared, attuned to the invisible threads of movement only he could detect. He recognized the pattern instantly. Carter Wrek's attempt to intimidate, testing boundaries, seeing how far he could push. Sebastian did not move toward the threat. He allowed it to unfold, letting Carter Wrek overreach, revealing himself without realizing the trap he walked into. Observation was patience. Patience was power. Meanwhile, Isolde's fingers traced patterns in the blanket, her gaze distant. Sebastian noticed the subtle tremor in her hands, the tension in her jaw. Her grief, the private, hidden wound she carried, was unspoken but ever present. He had not yet confronted it directly, and she had not revealed it. But he felt it, as if the absence of life she bore silently weighed on his chest as much as hers. Sebastian, she began softly, voice trembling. Do you ever regret interfering? Coming into my life? He paused, considering. Centuries had taught him detachment, control, the removal of emotional entanglement. Yet with Isolde, the rules shifted imperceptibly. Regret is irrelevant, he said finally. Some things demand action. Some people, some moments cannot be ignored. Her lips quivered faintly. Even if it complicates everything. Yes, he replied simply. Even then, the faint chime of a phone on the street below confirmed what he had suspected. Carter Wrek was desperate, his network unraveling. His attempts at intimidation now carried risk, not just to him, but to the fragile image he maintained. Sebastian allowed himself a brief satisfaction. The man's power was crumbling, silent, and absolute. Do you ever feel safe? Isolde asked suddenly, her voice breaking the quiet. Sebastian's hand hovered near hers, careful not to intrude, yet offering presence. Safety is a construct, he said. But you are under my protection. For now, that is as close as you will get. Her gaze lifted to him, shadows of doubt and grief mingling in her eyes. And if I fall apart, you will not, he said firmly. Not while I am here. Hours passed with quiet observation. Sebastian moved through the townhouse like a shadow, always watching, always calculating. He had dismantled Carter Wrek's network piece by piece, ensured no one could threaten Isolde. And yet, he understood that true danger lay not just in physical harm, but in the invisible wound she carried. The loss of the baby, unspoken, was a quiet poison that eroded her resilience even as he bolstered it with his vigilance. Finally, night deepened. The city hummed with indifferent energy, unaware of the quiet battle unfolding above. Sebastian returned to Isolde, sitting beside her, letting her lean against him without words. Presence, patience, and vigilance. The weapons he wielded for protection now served as comfort as well. And somewhere deep inside, he recognized a dangerous truth. He had begun to care for her, not as a task, not as a responsibility, but as something personal, something human. And caring, he knew, made him vulnerable. Outside, Carter Wrek's shadow lingered still, fragile but persistent, a reminder that danger was never gone entirely. But inside the townhouse, one truth remained unchallenged. Sebastian Crowl would not allow harm to touch Isolde Hawl. And in that truth, for tonight, they found a fragile, unspoken peace. The first real threat arrived just after midnight. A quiet knock at the townhouse door, deliberate, measured, testing the limits. Sebastian had been anticipating it. Carter Wrek's recklessness had grown too bold to remain invisible. The vampire moved before anyone could react, red and black blending seamlessly with the shadows, hair bound tight, eyes sharp as obsidian. Isolde stirred in the living room, blanket clutched tightly around her shoulders. Someone's at the door, she whispered, voice trembling. Her instinct for caution had not dulled, though fatigue weighed heavily on her. Sebastian approached silently. He did not answer. He did not unlock the door. Instead, he positioned himself strategically, one hand on the wall for balance, senses stretched across the room and beyond. Carter Wrek was out there, desperate, blinded by rage and panic, unaware that every move he made had been anticipated, measured, countered. A shadow fell across the frosted glass. Sebastian could see it, could feel the tension radiating from the man. He stepped closer, carefully, silently. The door rattled under a subtle force, testing, probing. Sebastian remained still, an immovable barrier in black and red, waiting. Carter, Sebastian said finally, voice low and dangerous, carrying across the threshold. Go home. You have nothing left here. Nothing to take. Nothing to threaten. The knock stopped. A pause. Then, a sneer, audible even through the wood. You think you've won? Carter's voice, frantic but brittle, carried the weight of desperation. I'll find a way. I always do. Sebastian's eyes narrowed. Not here. Not with her. Not ever again. The threat lingered in the night air, unfulfilled, impotent. Sebastian did not need to strike. He never needed to strike. Fear, carefully applied, was often enough. Carter Wrek would retreat, only to realize later that even retreat had consequences he could not control. Inside, Isolde breathed shallowly, hands tightening on the blanket. Why? Why do you let him stay out there? She asked quietly. Because desperation makes him predictable, Sebastian replied, voice calm. And predictable men are easily contained. She shook her head. I don't know how you can watch it all and stay so calm. Sebastian's lips twitched faintly, almost imperceptibly. Centuries teach patience. Observation is survival. Emotion is a tool, not a weakness. Her gaze lingered on him, searching, vulnerable. And yet, I feel you care, even if you don't say it. He hesitated, almost imperceptibly. That was a vulnerability he rarely allowed. Caution, he said finally. Do not mistake vigilance for sentiment. But even as he spoke, he felt the subtle pull of something he had not felt in centuries. A human connection, delicate and dangerous, tugging at a corner of his carefully constructed immortality. Hours passed. Carter Wrek's shadow eventually retreated, leaving only faint traces of his presence. Sebastian moved through the townhouse, silently ensuring every lock, every window, every potential entry point was secure. He did not rest. Not yet. Not until he knew she was safe. Isolde remained quiet, curled into the chaise, eyes distant. The grief she carried, her private loss, weighed on her shoulders more heavily than any threat outside. Sebastian watched her carefully, understanding that protecting her from external danger was only part of his responsibility. The internal wounds were far deeper, far more difficult to shield. You don't have to carry it alone, he said softly, moving to kneel beside her. I am here. Always. She looked at him, tears glistening faintly at the corners of her eyes. It's not just the danger, she whispered. It's everything else. The baby, what I lost, it's constant. Silent. It doesn't leave me. Sebastian felt the ache of her grief, as though it were his own, a rare and unwelcome intrusion of emotion. He placed a hand near hers, careful not to cross boundaries she had not yet allowed him to cross. I cannot undo it, he admitted quietly, but I can endure it with you. Stand beside you. Protect you. Her gaze dropped. And if I break, then I will be there, he said, voice firm and unwavering, because I will not allow you to be broken alone. The night deepened, heavy with tension, grief, and the remnants of Carter Wrek's desperate shadow. Outside, the city moved with indifferent rhythm, oblivious to the subtle, invisible battle that had just unfolded. Inside, two lives existed in fragile balance. One human, one immortal, bound together by circumstances neither could have anticipated. And somewhere deep within, Sebastian realized a dangerous truth he had avoided for centuries. He could no longer maintain detachment. His care for Isolde, once distant and calculated, had begun to root itself in something far more profound, far more perilous. Because protecting her was no longer just duty. It was personal, and personal, he knew, meant vulnerability. The city was restless, lights flickering across the skyline, as if in silent warning. Sebastian felt it first, a subtle vibration beneath the streets, the faint hum of a predator desperate and reckless. Carter Wrek was no longer content to threaten from the shadows. Desperation had made him bold, dangerous, and, most importantly, predictable. Inside the townhouse, Isolde sat at the window, staring at the city like it held answers she would never find. Her hands rested on the blanket across her lap, fingers tracing invisible patterns. Sebastian watched her quietly from across the room, aware that her grief had begun to shift. No longer only private, but threatening to spill into every corner of their carefully constructed sanctuary. The loss of her child weighed on her like a silent storm, relentless and invisible. A sudden crash downstairs pulled both of them into tense awareness. Sebastian moved first, silent as smoke, red and black blending with shadow. His senses flared. Carter had made a direct move, breaking through boundaries, testing the limits of Sebastian's patience. Isolde flinched. "He's here," she whispered, voice barely audible, trembling. "No," Sebastian said firmly. "He's foolish. He is blind to what surrounds him." The intruder's footsteps were clumsy, betraying both desperation and arrogance. Sebastian descended the staircase like a shadow with purpose, long coat brushing silently against polished wood. Carter Wrek had underestimated him again, failing to anticipate that Sebastian did not react impulsively, did not confront recklessly. The vampire calculated, controlled, every step designed to end the threat before it could manifest. "You will leave," Sebastian said when he stepped into view, voice low, commanding. Red lining of his suit caught the faint light like warning fire. Carter froze, eyes widening, realizing too late that the man before him was no ordinary protector. "You think you can stop me?" Carter snapped, panic and fury lacing his words. "Oh, you have nothing left to take," Sebastian interrupted. "Nothing." The room grew cold. Carter's bravado faltered under the weight of Sebastian's presence. Minutes passed like hours, every heartbeat amplified in the tension-choked air. Carter Wrek realized he had walked into the trap of his own desperation. Inside, Isolde watched silently, unable to tear her gaze away from the confrontation. Her grief, her private wound, made her almost imperceptibly vulnerable, yet she did not panic. She had survived brutality before. She could survive this. But the knowledge of her loss, the silence surrounding it, made her feel as if the weight of centuries pressed against her chest. Sebastian's eyes never left Carter. Every subtle movement, every tremor of his frame, he cataloged. He allowed the man's fear to unfold without interference. The vampire did not strike, did not intimidate further than necessary. Silence, presence, patience, these were enough. Carter Wrek would crumble without a single blow. Finally, Carter faltered, a crack in his carefully constructed mask of arrogance. You cannot threaten her again," Sebastian said, voice calm, inexorable. "Your power is gone. Your control is over. Leave or suffer consequences you cannot imagine." Carter Wrek fled without another word, leaving only faint traces of desperation and humiliation behind. The city outside continued, oblivious. Sebastian returned to Isolde, kneeling beside her. She flinched slightly at his presence, but he placed a steadying hand near hers, not touching, offering only the promise of support. "He is gone," Sebastian said quietly, "and he will not return." Her eyes filled with tears, the first real sign of the grief she had carried silently for so long. "It's not just him," she whispered, voice trembling. "It's everything. The baby, the life we lost." Sebastian's chest tightened. For centuries, he had avoided this. He had never felt grief as deeply, never carried someone else's pain so intimately. Yet here it was, piercing through centuries of control, unrelenting. "I know," he said softly, "and I cannot undo it. But I can stand beside you. You do not have to carry it alone." Her shoulders trembled, tears spilling freely now. She buried her face against her knees, unable to speak. Sebastian did not move. He did not rush comfort. He simply remained, presence steady, a sentinel in red and black, letting her grief unfold in its own time. Hours passed in quiet companionship. The storm of Carter Wrek's threat dissipated, but the storm inside Isolde remained. Sebastian understood that some wounds were too deep for immediate healing, that some losses could not be erased. Yet he also understood that the act of presence, the quiet endurance of shared grief, was a kind of salvation. "You're stronger than you know," he said finally, voice low, resonant. "Even in loss, even in silence, you endure." She lifted her head slowly, eyes glimmering in the dim light. "And you never falter," she whispered. "Even when I feel broken, you stay." Sebastian's lips curved faintly, almost imperceptibly, because some things are worth vigilance. Some lives worth more than centuries of indifference. Outside, the city hummed, unaware that a predator and a survivor had forged a fragile sanctuary from chaos and grief. Inside, one human and one immortal shared the unspoken truth. Even in the deepest loss, there could be protection, presence, and a glimmer of hope. And Sebastian Crowl knew, with dangerous clarity, that caring for her had become far more than duty. It had become personal, and personal was a vulnerability he could no longer deny. Dawn broke over Chicago, pale lights spilling across the skyline, washing the city in a soft, almost forgiving glow. Sebastian stood at the window, red and black silhouette sharp against the morning, white hair tied neatly in its precise ponytail. The city hummed, unaware of the storm that had passed. The quiet war waged in shadows, the desperation of men like Carter Wrek, the fragile endurance of a woman who had survived too much. Carter Wrek would not return. Sebastian had ensured it. Every trace of influence, every shred of power that man had clung to was gone. He would be left with nothing but his own failures, and the lessons would be slow, unavoidable, and absolute. Sebastian did not feel satisfaction. He felt resolution. The threat was neutralized. The city, once again indifferent, continued to move. Isolde Hawl sat on the chaise, the blanket around her shoulders, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She had cried through the night, and for the first time, she seemed lighter, as if releasing grief into the presence of someone who would endure it with her made the weight tolerable. Her eyes, though still dark with sorrow, carried a fragile glimmer, a signal that she could begin again. Sebastian approached silently, careful not to break the delicate calm. "He is gone," he said simply, voice low, carrying both certainty and reassurance. She nodded slowly. "I know." Her lips curved faintly, a tentative smile, almost imperceptible. "Thank you for staying." He knelt beside her, eyes locking with hers. "You did not need me to fight your battles," he said, "but you deserve to be protected. Always." Her gaze softened. "And what about everything else?" Her voice faltered, a whisper of all the pain she had carried in silence. The loss, the grief, the silence that followed. Sebastian's hand hovered near hers, careful, deliberate. "I cannot undo what is gone," he admitted, "but I can bear it with you. Not as a replacement for what was lost, but as a witness, a guardian, a presence you do not have to face alone." Tears welled in her eyes, glinting like fragile stars in the pale morning light. She exhaled slowly, leaning slightly toward him, the first movement of trust in days. "I don't know if I deserve that," she whispered. "You do," he said firmly, "and you always will. Surviving, enduring, it is not weakness. It is proof of strength beyond measure." A silence fell between them, heavy but not uncomfortable. The tension of the past nights, the fear, the grief, the shadow of Carter Wrek, had dissolved into something steadier. Presence, patience, and shared endurance had forged a fragile sanctuary. The storm had passed, leaving quiet aftermath, but Sebastian knew the truth. Some storms linger in memory, and some wounds do not fully heal. Yet here, in this space, in this morning, there was possibility. There was survival. There was fragile hope. He finally reached out, placing his hand lightly over hers. She did not pull away. The gesture was small, almost mundane, yet profound in its implication. For the first time, Sebastian allowed himself to acknowledge what he had long denied. Caring for Isolde Hawl was no longer mere duty. It was personal, dangerous, yes, but undeniably real. Outside, the city moved on, oblivious to the quiet victory within the townhouse. Carter Wrek's influence had evaporated like mist under sunlight. His arrogance, his cruelty, his desperation, all rendered impotent by calculated patience and relentless precision. But the true victory was not in punishing him. It was in safeguarding what mattered. Isolde lifted her eyes to his. I don't know what comes next," she said softly. Sebastian's lips curved faintly. "Next," he said, voice steady, "is living. Not merely surviving. Not merely enduring. but existing with purpose, with safety, and with the knowledge that you are not alone. A subtle smile broke across her face, fragile but undeniable. Then, maybe I can start again, she whispered. You will, Sebastian said, voice low, unwavering. And I will be here, watching, waiting, protecting. For a moment, the room was still. The sunlight crept further across the floor, illuminating the red and black of Sebastian's attire, the faint glint in his eyes, and a fragile resilience in hers. The vampire and the human shared a quiet, unspoken understanding. Some connections were forged not in comfort, but in endurance. Some bonds were strengthened not by joy, but by surviving the unthinkable together. Sebastian finally rose, moving to the window to watch the city awaken. The weight of centuries had taught him patience, control, and detachment. Yet here, standing beside the woman who had endured so much, he realized that some truths, some emotions, could not be ignored, even by an immortal. He returned to Isolde, kneeling once more. The past is done, he said softly. The threats are gone, and now it is time for life. Her hand met his, a quiet, deliberate choice. Not out of obligation, but trust. Not out of fear, but recognition of a presence that would endure, no matter what storms might come. And for the first time in a long, long while, Sebastian allowed himself a single thought. Some lives were worth the vulnerability. Some losses could be shared. Some hearts, though human, fragile, and mortal, could teach an immortal what it meant to truly care. Carter Wrek was finished. The city moved on. But here, in this quiet morning, a vampire in red and black, and a woman who had survived everything, found a fragile, unshakable victory. And that victory, silent, private, and eternal, was enough. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate you taking the time to be here and supporting the channel. If you enjoyed this content, don't forget to like, comment, and share. It really helps me reach more amazing people like you. And make sure to subscribe/follow so you don't miss any future videos or live sessions. I'd love to hear from you too, so drop your thoughts or questions in the comments below. Thanks again for being here, and I can't wait to see you in the next one.